Imagine a night so dark, secrets whispering in every shadow, where the line between truth and deception blurs. In a mansion full of hidden motives, a murder shrouded in mystery awaits its unraveling. But one man, Poe, has his own game to play, and he knows that every twist of fate has its own cost. Will the truth be revealed, or will the web of lies continue to suffocate the innocent? Hold your breath, because this mystery will keep you guessing till the very last breath. The fire crackled softly in the hearth of Paul's modest yet immaculately ordered apartment, its warmth casting flickering shadows across the room. Paul, with an almost obsessive precision, adjusted his mustache, each movement deliberate as he stared into the mirror, while Hastings sifted through the morning's mail. Hastings paused, his fingers brushing against a particularly thick cream-colored envelope, its edges sharp and pristine, clearly something of importance. He unfolded it, scanning the contents before his brow furrowed in thought. "It's from Lord Arthur Winslow," he muttered, his voice low and laced with curiosity. Paul, his expression unreadable, glanced up. "Winslow? The financier?" Hastings nodded. "Indeed. He writes that he fears for his life. Here, listen to this." He cleared his throat, his voice shifting to mimic the urgency of the letter's author. "Paul, I beg of you, come to Winslow Manor immediately. I am being watched. There are whispers in the dark shadows that move when no one should. I've uncovered something I was never meant to see. If you delay, I may not live to tell you more. Come at once, before it is too late." Paul's gaze hardened, his fingers tapping together in a rhythmic pattern of contemplation. Whispers in the dark, shadows that move. A man of his stature isn't prone to flights of fancy, he murmured, his tone cold. "Do you think he's truly in danger?" Hastings asked, concern creeping into his voice. Paul's eyes narrowed, a calculated glint flashing within them. "I think, Hastings, that Lord Winslow is already dead." Hastings recoiled, his voice catching in his throat. "But the letter only arrived today." Paul's gaze turned sharp, the pieces of the puzzle already falling into place. "Exactly. And yet, it reeks of finality. We're too late." Without another word, Paul rose from his seat, donning his hat and coat with a swift elegance, signaling for Hastings to follow. Within the hour, the two were aboard a train, the letter weighing heavily between them like a dark omen. The countryside rushed past, its green expanses distant and indifferent to the events unfolding. Somewhere out there, a man had cried for help, yet somewhere deeper, in the vastness of the unknown, a hand had already silenced him. The train screeched to a halt at Winslow Manor, the sky overhead dull and oppressive, mirroring the mood that gripped them both as they stepped onto the platform. The manor, a brooding silhouette against the overcast sky, loomed ahead, its windows dark and its very presence stifling. Hastings shivered despite himself. "I don't like this, Paul. Something's not right here." Paul's lips curled into a slight knowing smile. "You feel it too then?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur. "A house that has recently suffered a great disturbance." As they approached the massive oak doors, Hastings knocked twice. The silence that followed was thick and unnerving, stretching out into an eternity before the door creaked open. A frail, elderly butler stood before them, his pale face drawn and lifeless. "You are expected," he intoned, his voice scarcely above a whisper, stepping aside to let them pass. The air inside the manor was thick with a peculiar stillness, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. "Where is Lord Winslow?" Paul inquired, his voice sharp and commanding. The butler hesitated, his hands trembling ever so slightly. "In his study, sir. But I must warn you." Paul, already moving, waved the warning away, his mind already racing with possibilities. The grand staircase seemed to stretch endlessly upward as they ascended, each step creaking underfoot, a constant reminder of the weight that hung in the air. Hastings couldn't shake the sense of unease. "This whole place feels wrong, Paul. I don't like it." Paul's fingers brushed the polished banister, his voice a mere whisper. "It's not just the house. Something has happened here. Something irreversible." Reaching the top, the butler stopped in front of a large, ornately carved door, his expression tightening. "You must see for yourself," he said, his voice trembling with unspoken dread, before pushing the door open. The flickering light of a lone lamp illuminated the study, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. In the center of the room, Lord Arthur Winslow sat at his desk, his head slightly bowed, as if lost in thought. But the dark stain spreading across his chest told a far different story. He was very much dead. Hastings gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Good heavens! He's been shot." Paul stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. "Indeed. But tell me, Hastings, where is the gun?" Hastings blinked in confusion. "Well, surely it must be somewhere, right?" He began to search the desk, the floor, but there was no sign of the weapon. The desk was cleared of everything except for a few scattered papers, the floor bare. Paul's brow furrowed as he studied the scene, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. A man shot at close range, and yet there's no weapon. Curious indeed. The butler, standing in the doorway, cleared his throat nervously. "Inspector Darnley arrived before you, sir. He's already examined the body." The deep, confident voice of Inspector Felix Darnley rang out from the doorway. His presence was as imposing as his smug expression. "Ah, I see you found the body. I suppose you're here to investigate," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "A formality, of course. This case is open and shut. The secretary, Miss Alana Graves, did it. Motive: inheritance. Means: a gun that unfortunately is missing. Opportunity: she was last seen arguing with the deceased." Paul's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint amused smile. "Open and shut, you say?" he murmured, his gaze lingering on Darnley. Darnley smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "What's the matter, Paul? Don't agree with my assessment?" Paul, his expression unreadable, straightened his gloves with deliberate slowness. "Murder, Inspector, is never as simple as it seems," he replied, his voice calm and calculating. He turned back to the body, his mind already racing. "And I suspect this is no ordinary murder." His voice dropped, becoming barely a whisper. "The true murderer is among us, and they are not who they seem." The fire crackled softly in the hearth of Paul's quaint apartment, the scent of burning wood, mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee as he carefully adjusted his mustache in front of the mirror. Hastings, ever the dutiful companion, flipped through the morning's mail, his expression unreadable. "Ah, here's something of interest," he muttered, unfolding a thick cream-colored envelope. "It's from Lord Arthur Winslow." Paul paused, his fingers frozen mid-air as he raised an eyebrow. "Lord Winslow, you say? A man of some renown, isn't he?" Hastings glanced up. "Indeed, a notable figure in financial circles. Though it seems he's not just writing for pleasantries." Paul leaned forward as Hastings read aloud the contents of the letter, his voice heavy with concern. "Paul, I implore you to come to Winslow Manor at once. I am being watched. There are whispers in the dark shadows that move when none should. I have uncovered something I should not have seen. If you delay, I may not live to tell you more. Come with haste, before it is too late." Paul's lips tightened as he listened, his expression inscrutable. "Shadows that move, whispers in the dark. Hastings, this does not sound like the fears of a mere businessman. This is something more." Hastings shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think he's in real danger?" Paul didn't respond immediately, his gaze distant as he processed the words. "I think, Hastings, that Lord Winslow is already dead." Hastings blinked in disbelief. "But the letter only arrived today." Paul steepled his fingers, his face betraying nothing. "The timing is too perfect, Hastings. Too convenient. We must go immediately." Without another word, Paul rose, donned his hat and coat, and signaled for Hastings to follow. Within the hour, they were aboard a train bound for the remote countryside, the weight of the letter pressing heavily between them, its ominous message echoing in their minds. As the train sliced through the foggy expanse of the English countryside, Paul's sharp eyes narrowed, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. Somewhere out there, a man had made a desperate plea for help. Somewhere out there, a hand had already silenced him. When they arrived at Winslow Manor, The atmosphere was stifling. The house, large and imposing, stood like a sentinel in the murky twilight, its windows dark and foreboding. The air was thick with a strange stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Hastings knocked twice on the grand oak door. It creaked open, revealing an elderly butler, his face pale and drawn. "You are expected," he whispered, stepping aside. Poirot's eyes scanned the shadowed hallway, his senses immediately alert to the oppressive atmosphere. "Where is Lord Winslow?" he asked. The butler hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously. "In his study, sir. But I must warn you." Poirot was already moving, his footsteps steady and purposeful. As they ascended the grand staircase, Hastings couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. "I don't like this, Poirot. The whole place feels wrong." Poirot's fingers brushed the polished banister, his voice a murmur. "A house that has recently suffered a great disturbance. Do you not feel it, Hastings?" They reached the study, and the butler stopped before a large carved door, his voice trembling. "You must see for yourself." He pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. The flickering glow of a lamp cast unsettling shadows, and in the center, seated at his desk, was Lord Arthur Winslow. His head hung slightly, as though in thought, but the dark stain across his chest told a different story. He was dead. Hastings gasped, his eyes wide with shock. "Good heavens, he's been shot." Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. "Indeed, Hastings. But tell me, where is the weapon?" Hastings blinked, glancing around the desk. Surely it must be. But the desk was clean, the floor bare, the air heavy with the absence of the weapon. Curious, Poirot mused. A man shot at close range, yet no sign of the instrument of death. The butler cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Inspector Darnley arrived before you, sir." His already Poirot's gaze flickered. "Ah, I see, you found the body." The voice rang out from the doorway, deep and confident. Inspector Felix Darnley entered, his coat damp from the rain, his demeanor one of calculated authority. "I suppose you're here to investigate," he said smoothly, his eyes gleaming with self-assurance. "The case is quite open and shut. The secretary did it. Elena Graves. Motive? Inheritance. Means a gun. Regrettably missing. Opportunity. She had access to his study at all times." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his fingers steepling together. "Open and shut, you say?" Darnley's smug smile deepened. "I see sarcasm is in fashion. You disagree?" Poirot merely smoothed his gloves. "Murder is rarely as simple as it seems, Inspector." Darnley chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Experience, Monsieur Poirot. You should try it sometime." Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. "Ah, but I do. And experience has taught me that the simplest answers are often the wrong ones." As Darnley turned to speak with one of his officers, Poirot stepped closer to the body. His gaze traveled over Lord Winslow's lifeless form, every detail examined with the precision of a master detective. "Tell me, Hastings," Poirot murmured, "what strikes you as odd?" Hastings hesitated, unsure. "Well, the missing weapon, I suppose. But something else." Poirot's sharp gaze flickered toward the body's posture. "Look at the way he sits." His body leaned slightly forward, as though he were speaking with someone at the moment of death. Poirot's voice lowered. He didn't expect violence. His killer was someone he trusted. Hastings frowned, unsure. "You think it was Miss Graves?" Poirot didn't respond immediately, his mind racing as he scanned the room for more clues. His eyes landed on the fireplace, where a small pile of ash lay. With careful precision, Poirot reached for a half-burned scrap of paper, its edges crumbling with age. The words were barely legible, but one phrase stood out. "Darnley knows." Hastings inhaled sharply. "You don't think?" Poirot tucked the paper into his pocket, his voice soft but filled with a dangerous edge. "I think, Hastings, that Inspector Darnley may be more involved in this than he would like us to believe." As Darnley spoke with his officers, Poirot's mind swirled with the implications of the fragment in his pocket. "Tell me, Inspector," Poirot interjected smoothly, "what time did you arrive?" Darnley's brow furrowed slightly. "Just after the shot was fired. I happened to be nearby." Poirot's smile was serene, though his eyes gleamed with something darker. Fortunate timing, indeed. Darnley's expression hardened. Is there a point to this interrogation, Poirot? I've already identified the culprit. Poirot's smile never faltered. Ah, but I am a creature of habit, Inspector. And I do not like things that fit together too perfectly. A murder, a suspect, a missing weapon, everything tied up in a neat little bow. It's too convenient. Hastings shifted uneasily. Poirot, surely you're not suggesting. Poirot held up a hand. I suggest nothing, Hastings. I merely observe. And what I observe, mon ami, is a case solved far too quickly. And when a case is solved too quickly, it is usually because someone wants it that way. Darnley's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Poirot turned to leave, his voice lowering. This is a game, Inspector. But I assure you, it is far from over. Poirot's mind raced with the implications of the scrap of paper, the words haunting him. Darnley knows. What did the inspector know? And why was someone so desperate to keep him silent? The scene unfolded with a heavy air of certainty around Inspector Darley, who stood surveying the room with an almost smug expression, as if the entire matter had already been resolved in his mind. His voice, smooth and laced with condescension, broke the silence. Tell me, Poirot, he began, his gaze unwavering, as he appraised the detective before him. Do you truly believe your presence here is necessary? The case, after all, is quite straightforward. A dead man, a missing weapon, and a suspect with a clear motive. No need for further inquiry. Poirot, adjusting his cuffs with a deliberate care, merely smiled, the corners of his lips curling upward in a manner that suggested he was far from convinced by Darley's overconfident assessment. Ah, but you will indulge me, won't you? I find myself most curious to hear your account, Inspector. Darley exhaled as if humoring an underling, rather than engaging with a fellow investigator. I was passing by the estate when I heard the gunshot. Naturally, I rushed in and, upon entering the study, found Lord Winslow slumped over his desk, shot in the chest, no weapon in sight, and no signs of forced entry. The only logical conclusion is that the killer fled the scene and disposed of the weapon before I arrived. He paused, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction at his own deductions. Poirot tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, and then replied with his signature calm. A most decisive assessment, Inspector. You were quite certain of these facts upon your immediate inspection, I take it. Darley's lips curled slightly as he leaned back, his air one of quiet superiority. Experience teaches one to recognize a crime of passion when one sees it, Poirot. Miss Elena Graves had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. If you wish to pursue flights of fancy, feel free, but the evidence is clear. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on Darley, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. Is it indeed? He murmured, the words almost lost in the air between them. Then let us examine this evidence, Inspector, for sometimes the truth is more elusive than it appears. Darley met Poirot's gaze with unwavering resolve, but beneath the surface, Poirot could sense a slight, almost imperceptible tension in the inspector's stance. The detective's mind was already working through the inconsistencies, and Poirot's next move was one of precision. He motioned to Hastings, who followed closely, as the two of them stepped away from the study and into the grand hallway. The air in the hallway was thick with the nervous tension of the house staff. Two maids stood whispering anxiously, their faces pale from the shock of the events, while the groundskeeper lingered nearby, twisting his cap between his fingers. Poirot turned to the elder of the maids, a woman with graying hair and an air of quiet authority. I ask only that you recount the events of this evening, as you recall them, Poirot said, his voice soft but commanding. What time was it when you first heard the gunshot? The maid hesitated, clearly trying to recall the events with the clarity of a witness recounting a tragedy. Sir, we were just finishing supper in the kitchen, she began, her voice shaky but steadying, as she spoke. Must have been 8:30 when we heard it. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, making a mental note. He then turned to the groundskeeper, who shifted uncomfortably under the detective's piercing gaze. And you? Poirot asked, his tone calm but probing. The man stammered before answering. I was in the stables, but I heard it too. That was 28, sure as anything. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings, the faintest glimmer of understanding passing between them. He then turned back to the witnesses, his voice cool and controlled. "You are certain of the time?" The maid nodded, her expression firm. "Yes, sir. The cook was just clearing the dishes. She'll tell you the same." Poirot's mustache twitched slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. He said nothing for a moment, letting the silence stretch before turning to Hastings and murmuring, "Mon ami, I believe we have uncovered a most interesting contradiction." Hastings frowned in confusion, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with an almost predatory sharpness. "Well, Hastings, did you not hear? Inspector Darley claims to have heard the gunshot, and rushed in immediately. Yet according to these witnesses, the shot rang out a full 20 minutes before he could have arrived. Does that not strike you as curious?" Poirot's voice was soft but deliberate, planting a seed of doubt in Hastings' mind. Hastings' frown deepened as he processed this, his mind racing. Poirot moved with practiced precision, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the room for details others might miss. He stopped near the fireplace, crouching slightly as his gaze flickered toward the smoldering embers. There, nestled among the dying flames, was a small scrap of half-burned paper. Poirot retrieved it with the utmost care, his fingers careful not to disturb the fragile remnants. Holding it up to the light, he could just make out the faintest of letters. "Darley knows." The words were barely legible, but unmistakable. Hastings inhaled sharply, his heart skipping a beat. That surely means Darley," he murmured, his mind racing with the implications. But what could Winslow have meant? What was he trying to tell us? Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead he turned his attention toward the large wooden desk, his fingers grazing its surface in a manner that spoke of quiet curiosity. As if guided by instinct, he moved to a corner where a small compartment was slightly ajar. With a gentle tug, the drawer slid open, revealing an unlocked and empty safe. Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. "Strange," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "No jewels, no money, nothing of value has been taken." Hastings, peering over Poirot's shoulder, frowned. "Then what? Why empty the safe at all?" Poirot's gaze flickered briefly to the open window. "Only papers, Hastings. Papers carefully removed. What was so important about them that someone would go to such lengths to retrieve them?" Hastings looked at Poirot, his frown deepening. "Do you think Winslow was hiding something?" Poirot turned away from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Possibly," he replied. "But what intrigues me most is not just what was taken, but why. Why was someone so intent on removing these particular papers? And why does Darley's presence here feel so rehearsed?" His words trailed off as the gears in his mind turned relentlessly, piecing together a puzzle that no one else seemed to notice. This was far from a straightforward case, and Poirot was determined to uncover the layers that remained hidden beneath the surface. The game, it seemed, was far from over. Poirot stood by the open window, the cold night air sweeping into the room, causing a slight shiver to run down his spine. The chill seemed almost intentional, as though the very elements were conspiring to add an eerie layer to the scene. Hastings, his brow furrowed, couldn't help but ask, "Do you think someone could have entered through here?" Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead he dusted his hands together slowly, the gesture almost ritualistic. "Perhaps," he replied, his voice carrying an almost amused tone. "Or perhaps, mon ami, someone wishes us to believe they did." He turned sharply, his face unreadable, his sharp eyes fixed on the room around him. "The details do not fit," Poirot murmured. "And when a puzzle is forced together too neatly, one must always ask who arranged the pieces." He crouched beside the window, his gloved fingers lightly tracing the damp earth outside. The night had left its mark on the ground. Clear and deep in the mud was a single footprint, standing out like a message, a clear contrast against the otherwise pristine surroundings. Hastings leaned over, his breath catching as he saw the print. "A footprint," he said, his voice laced with growing intrigue. "That's something, isn't it? It must belong to the killer, don't you think?" Poirot's lips barely twitched as he ran a gloved finger along the edge of the print. "A most interesting thought, mon ami," he replied. "Tell me, do you recall the shoes of the household?" Hastings blinked in confusion. The shoes. Poirot gestured toward the footprint, his eyes narrowing. This is no ordinary mark, Hastings. Look closely. The sole pattern is distinctive. It's no larger than Lord Winslow's own shoes, and certainly not like the butler's or Miss Graves. Yet Inspector Darley insists there was no intruder. Curious, isn't it? Hastings paused, his mind working through the implications. You think this footprint belongs to someone else, someone who shouldn't have been here? Poirot straightened, his face tightening in resolve. Exactly, he murmured. And observe, Hastings. The window's latch is unbroken. The study floor shows no trace of mud. If someone entered through here, where are the other footprints? Hastings' eyes widened as realization set in. You mean it was planted? Poirot's smile was tight, his expression almost grim. Indeed, someone is trying very hard to mislead us. But Poirot does not like to be misled. He turned toward the desk, his eyes scanning the papers scattered across its surface. As he moved, his fingers brushed against something wedged between the pages of an open ledger. A small scrap of torn paper, fragile and yellowed with age, came free with a careful pull. Poirot examined it closely before passing it to Hastings. A fragment of a book, Poirot said softly, his brow furrowing. An old detective novel, if I am not mistaken. Hastings chuckled, his confusion apparent. A novel? What's that got to do with anything? Poirot tapped the edge of the page, his fingers smudging the ink. See here, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The tear is recent, and the edges are smudged with ink. Someone held this page quite recently. Hastings frowned. But why tear a page from a book? Poirot's gaze darkened, the shadows beneath his eyes sharpening. Because, Hastings, our murderer is a man who enjoys theatrics. He does not merely commit a crime. He orchestrates it, like a story unfolding. And what is a detective novel, if not a lesson in misdirection? Hastings stiffened as the realization hit him. You mean to say, Poirot interrupted softly, his eyes glinting with the intensity of his thoughts. Yes, mon ami. This is no ordinary crime. It is a performance, and someone is playing a most dangerous game. Before Hastings could respond, the door opened, and the butler entered, holding a crisp envelope in his hand. His voice was uneasy. A letter for you, sir, he said, handing it over with a subtle tremor in his hand. Poirot accepted the envelope, the paper smooth beneath his fingers, the seal intact but hurriedly applied. He slid a finger beneath it, carefully unfolding the note inside. The words were short, scribbled hastily in uneven handwriting. Stay away. He knows everything. Hastings leaned over Poirot's shoulder, his face paling as he read the words aloud. Good Lord, that's a threat. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression calculating. Indeed, mon ami. But from whom? Hastings swallowed hard, his voice faltering. You think it's from the killer? Poirot's fingers traced the edge of the note, his eyes never leaving the paper. Perhaps, he said softly. Or perhaps from someone who knows the truth but fears to speak it. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, the tension in the room growing thicker. But he knows everything. A bold statement, Hastings. And yet, I wonder, who is this he? Hastings frowned, his mind whirring with possibilities. Darnley. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the letter, his lips parting slightly as he considered the options. Perhaps, he murmured, or someone much cleverer, someone who wishes to control the story rather than be part of it. His voice dropped to a whisper, as if the very air was too thick to carry his words. The question, mon ami, is not just what he knows, but what he intends to do about it. Poirot folded the letter carefully, his thoughts already racing. Somewhere, unseen, a hand was moving the pieces of this game. But whose hand? And to what end? Poirot leaned over the scattered notes he'd been gathering on Inspector Felix Darnley, his fingers lingering over the familiar details. Yet something about the man unsettled him. The inspector's eagerness, his self-assured manner, and that unnerving determination to close the case with swift precision. It was all too calculated. Hastings. Poirot's voice was measured, yet piercing as he spoke without lifting his gaze. What do we truly know of this inspector? Hastings, seated in a nearby chair, rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He's been with the force for nearly a decade. Rose quickly through the ranks. Known for his efficiency, he replied, his tone steady but laced with uncertainty. Poirot's mustache twitched as he shifted his focus, reaching for a telegram, its paper crackling in his hands. His fingers caressed the edges, folding it open with deliberate care. But let us not concern ourselves with what we are told, Poirot muttered, his gaze fixed on the text. Let us concern ourselves with what he is. His eyes hardened as he scanned the lines, then met Hastings' questioning look. There's something curious here. Darnley's record, or rather, his lack of one. Hastings blinked, surprised. Lack of one. What do you mean? Poirot's fingers drummed against the telegram, his eyes narrowing. There's no trace of him prior to 5 years ago. No official record. No commendations. No history. It's as if he appeared out of thin air, constructed precisely to fit the role he's playing. Hastings frowned, leaning in. You think he's hiding something? Poirot's voice dropped lower, a shadow crossing his expression. A man without a past is a man who has gone to great lengths to erase it. The weight of the words settled between them, thick with implication. Just as Poirot closed the telegram, the sound of the main door creaking open interrupted their conversation. 2 constables entered, flanking Eleanor Graves, her face pale, voice tremulous with panic. This is madness. I had nothing to do with this. Behind her Darnley stood with a quiet smile, an expression of controlled triumph. Miss Graves, he announced, his voice cool. You are under arrest for the murder of Lord Arthur Winslow. Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. Inspector, I must protest. Darnley's smile widened slightly, his eyes cold. Must you? You have no true evidence, he remarked, folding his arms across his chest. Poirot's gaze sharpened. A quarrel, a revised will circumstantial at best, and yet you move as though the verdict is already decided. Darnley's face remained impassive, but the tension between them was palpable. The Lord demands swift action. The longer we delay, the greater the risk of the trail going cold. Poirot's voice remained steady, though it carried a note of quiet defiance. And yet, a false conclusion is no better than no conclusion at all. As the constables led Eleanor away, her protests fading into the distance, Poirot turned to Hastings. An injustice has been done here, mon ami, and I do not believe the true killer fears the law at all. Back in Lord Winslow's study, Poirot's mind raced with the weight of the evening's events. He gestured for Hastings to close the door behind him. Tell me, Hastings, what was Lord Winslow's business? Hastings hesitated, then answered, finance, investments, banking. He was rather influential. Poirot nodded, his fingers tracing the edges of the desk. And yet, a man of such wealth invites a detective with a warning that his life is in danger. Hastings frowned, beginning to see the pattern. You think his business dealings have something to do with his death? Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead he pressed against the side of the desk, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment slid open. Hastings inhaled sharply, his eyes widening in surprise. Inside there was a stack of carefully bound documents. Poirot retrieved them, flipping through the pages with a practiced eye. Mon ami, he murmured. We were meant to believe this was a crime of passion, a quarrel over inheritance, a jilted secretary. But Lord Winslow was playing a far more dangerous game. He turned the pages toward Hastings, revealing a web of names, business partners, account numbers, an intricate financial labyrinth hidden behind the mask of a simple murder. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, and Poirot knew the true story was only beginning to unfold. Poirot leaned back in his chair, the weight of the new discovery pressing heavily on his mind. The case which had once seemed like a straightforward matter of inheritance gone awry, had transformed into something far more sinister, far more complex than he could have imagined. The documents from Lord Winslow's secret compartment had revealed patterns hidden within the mess of financial records and correspondence, patterns that hinted at something larger, something dangerous. The names of business partners, shady transactions, and encrypted messages swirled before Poirot's eyes. But one name kept resurfacing: Felix Darnley. Each time Poirot's eyes skimmed over it, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was no mistake. Darnley wasn't just an eager, overzealous investigator. He was deeply embedded in a conspiracy that had been carefully orchestrated from the start. Poirot could feel it in his bones. The man had been positioned as a perfect pawn, or perhaps a player, in a scheme far greater than anyone had realized. Hastings, standing at the far side of the study, watched Poirot's expression harden as he turned the pages of the dossier. The air in the room thickened, each second laden with more tension. Poirot's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was steady but filled with an urgency that made Hastings' pulse quicken. "Hastings, there's something terribly wrong here. This isn't just a case of murder. It's a carefully crafted narrative, an elaborate scheme, a web of deceit so tangled, it threatens to swallow anyone who dares to follow its threads." He dropped the papers onto the desk with a decisive thud, his brow furrowing as his mind raced. "Darnley, he's the key. He's not who he says he is, and I am beginning to suspect he never has been." Hastings, still digesting the gravity of the situation, approached cautiously, his eyes lingering on the stack of documents. The name Felix Darnley's seemed to jump out at him each time his gaze shifted. "You think he's behind it all, that he's manipulating the entire situation?" Poirot didn't respond immediately. His eyes were distant, focused on something beyond the study walls. Then, with a quiet sigh, he nodded slowly. "Not only that, Hastings. I believe he's been set up as a pawn in a game far more dangerous than either of us anticipated. His rapid rise through the ranks, his unshakable confidence, his uncanny ability to stay one step ahead. It's all too precise, too well orchestrated." He paused, his fingers drumming absently on the desk. "But there's more, Hastings. A man like Darnley, one without a past, one who exists in the shadows, does not act alone. Someone else is pulling the strings, and that person is far more dangerous than we can fathom." Suddenly, Poirot stood up, his chair scraping sharply against the floor as he moved towards the window. Hastings followed, standing beside him as they both peered into the mist-shrouded grounds of the manor. The moonlight barely pierced the dense fog, casting an eerie pallor over the estate. Then through the swirling mists a figure emerged, cloaked and hooded, moving with deliberate stealth toward the stables. Hastings pressed closer to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if the very air around them might hear him. Poirot, still and composed, didn't take his eyes off the figure. "A shadow," he replied softly. "Someone who knows more than we do. Someone who is playing their own game." The figure moved swiftly, vanishing into the fog before either of them could act. Hastings, momentarily stunned, turned back to Poirot. "Should we follow them? Find out what they're up to?" he suggested. But Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. "We're not ready for that yet. The night is their ally, not ours. We do not know if they are the hunter or the hunted." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But what we do know, Hastings, is that we are no longer just solving a murder. This is bigger than that. Someone is crafting this story, weaving it together with meticulous precision. And it's no accident that everything we've uncovered so far is part of a much larger puzzle." The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the mystery settling between them. Poirot turned back to the desk, his fingers lightly tracing the wood as if seeking answers in the grain. Then with a soft click, the hidden compartment slid open once more. The documents inside had not been disturbed, but now they seemed more vital than ever. Poirot lifted the first sheet, scanning its contents with a sharp eye. There were names, business partners, financial backers, mysterious figures whose roles were yet unclear. But then one name stood out above the rest, Felix Darnley. Poirot's grip tightened around the paper. Hastings leaned forward. What does this mean, Poirot? What was Winslow involved in? Why would he have these records? Poirot didn't answer immediately, instead reaching for a small delicate piece of paper that had been folded inside the stack. He held it up to the light, squinting at the smudged ink. The words were barely legible, but Poirot read aloud. Darnley is not to be trusted. Danger is near. He paused, his voice growing softer, more thoughtful. This is from Lord Winslow's final moments, Hastings. A warning. Poirot looked up at Hastings, his expression grim. Or perhaps, it was a warning for someone else. Hastings' heart skipped a beat. You think Winslow knew Darnley was coming for him? Poirot's gaze darkened. No, Hastings. I think Winslow feared someone much closer. Darnley was the tool, not the threat. He tapped the paper gently, his mind already racing through the possibilities. But what doesn't sit well with me, Hastings, is this: a man who is about to die doesn't waste time writing a warning, unless he believes he has time to deliver it. But Winslow didn't live. That tells me something very important. Hastings looked puzzled. What's that? Poirot exhaled slowly, his voice lowering. That he wasn't meant to die yet. This murder was not meant to appear as one at all. It's been staged, carefully constructed, every piece arranged to create the perfect illusion. The missing gun, the forced arrest of Mademoiselle Graves, the false suicide note. It's all part of someone's narrative. Hastings finally understood. Someone is creating a story, playing us all as pawns. Poirot's eyes flashed with resolve. Exactly, Manami. And there's one flaw in their carefully crafted play, one piece they didn't account for. He smiled grimly. But this game is far from over. We've only just begun to uncover the truth, and I won't rest until I know who's pulling the strings and why. Poirot sat at the writing desk in his guest quarters, his fingers rhythmically tapping against the polished wood, his gaze distant and unreadable. Hastings, standing in the doorway, couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Poirot had been uncharacteristically silent for hours, deep in thought, yet his quietude only served to deepen the tension between them. Finally, Hastings could no longer bear the silence. You're unusually quiet, Poirot, he remarked, his voice breaking the stillness. Poirot didn't look up, his focus fixed on some unseen horizon. I am constructing, Manami. A delicate, intricate design, he said at last, his voice low, carrying an undertone of gravity. A theory? A trap? Poirot's lips quirked into a slight, knowing smile. For the one who believes himself clever enough to deceive Hercule Poirot, he replied. His fingers hovered over a blank sheet of paper, and with deliberate strokes he began to write, the pen gliding across the surface. We shall inform everyone that new evidence has come to light, something irrefutable, something damning, he explained, his eyes cold as he penned the words. We will call a gathering at Winslow's estate, and there they will be lured into our web. Hastings leaned forward, his interest piqued. What evidence? Poirot paused, glancing up at Hastings with a faint, almost mocking amusement. Ah, Hastings, you wound me. The evidence is an illusion, it does not exist. He set down the pen, allowing his words to hang in the air like a quiet challenge. But if our quarry believes it does, they will be compelled to act, and when they do, he trailed off, his gaze sharp with anticipation. They will reveal themselves. Hastings' breath caught, the pieces of Poirot's plan beginning to fall into place. So it's a trap. Poirot nodded slowly, his expression now one of quiet determination. Indeed. There is an old saying, Manami, a man who fears exposure will run toward his own ruin. He folded the letter with meticulous care, his fingers swift and precise, then rang for the butler. See that this is delivered at once. The game is about to begin. The grand hall of Winslow Manor was charged with a tense silence, the air thick with suspicion and uncertainty. The guests had gathered, their faces a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Among them stood Eleanor Graves, still recovering from the unjust arrest that had nearly shattered her composure. The butler, rigid and alert in the corner, 2 maids whispering anxiously. And of course, Inspector Darnley. He stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled indifference, though his eyes flickered with the faintest hint of suspicion as Poirot entered. With a calm, almost regal air, Poirot nodded to the assembled guests. "Mummy, I thank you for coming. You will forgive my dramatics, but I have exciting news," he announced, his voice smooth, with an undertone of hidden meaning. Darnley's eyes narrowed, a shadow of skepticism clouding his features. "You claim to have new evidence?" he asked, his tone cool and dismissive. Poirot clasped his hands together, his smile, a perfect blend of charm and cunning. "Indeed, Inspector. The final piece of the puzzle." A murmur rippled through the room, the tension palpable as Poirot held the gathered company in rapt attention. Hastings, standing slightly behind Poirot, could feel the weight of the moment settling over the room like a thick fog. He noticed how Darnley shifted, his posture tightening ever so slightly, his jaw setting in a firm line. Poirot, ever observant, allowed the tension to build before breaking the silence with deliberate calculation. "But before I reveal it," he continued smoothly, "I should like to hear your thoughts, Inspector. After all, you have been most invested in this case." Darnley scoffed, but there was an edge to his response, a sharpness that betrayed his discomfort. "I have only sought to see justice done." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Ah, but whose justice, I wonder?" he mused, his voice low, almost a whisper. The inspector's eyes flickered, but his composure remained intact, though the faintest tremor of uncertainty was visible in his stance. Hastings, watching the exchange closely, felt the unmistakable chill of realization creeping up his spine. Darnley was not just uncomfortable, he was calculating, preparing for something, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before Darnley could regain control of the conversation, a constable entered the room, his voice hesitant. "Sir, we found this in Inspector Darnley's quarters." The room fell silent, as the constable held up a small wooden box, his hands trembling slightly. Poirot gestured for him to open it. The constable hesitated before carefully unlatching the box and lifting the lid. Inside, gleaming in the low light, lay a revolver. Darnley's breath caught audibly. Hastings felt his pulse quicken as he observed the unfolding scene with a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. Poirot moved forward, his movements measured and deliberate. "This may prove to be a fascinating discovery," he remarked, his tone cold, as he gestured to the constable. "Would you be so kind as to compare this weapon to the description of the missing murder weapon?" The constable, though visibly shaken, nodded and examined the revolver closely. "Same caliber, same model," he confirmed, his voice barely audible over the rising murmur of disbelief that spread through the room. Poirot clasped his hands together, his gaze fixed on Darnley. "How very unusual, Inspector, that a weapon identical to the one used in Lord Winslow's murder should find its way into your possession." Darnley's mouth pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. "This is absurd. It's a plant." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his smile never faltering. "A plant, like the one you so conveniently placed at Mademoiselle Graves' feet." Darnley exhaled sharply, his control slipping as he struggled to maintain composure. "You have no proof?" Poirot's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with a predatory intelligence. "Ah, but you misunderstand me, Mash," he said, his voice dripping with quiet amusement. "I do not need proof. All I needed was for you to panic. And as always, you have obliged me perfectly." A heavy silence settled over the room as the weight of Poirot's words hung in the air. For the first time, Darnley's facade cracked, revealing the growing panic beneath. The game, it seemed, was only just beginning. The tension in the grand hall of Winslow Manor had reached a boiling point, thick as the air before a storm. Felix Darnley, his face a portrait of barely contained panic, stood frozen before Poirot, who moved with a deliberate calm, his gaze unwavering. The long-dead remnants of Lord Winslow's final letter lay on the desk before him, its edges singed, the ink faded almost beyond recognition, but Poirot had already anticipated this. As he took a small vial from the table, a flicker of realization passed through Hastings' eyes. He watched riveted, as Poirot dipped a delicate brush into the liquid, and gently began to sweep it across the brittle paper. A simple chemical reagent, Poirot explained, his voice soft but sharp with purpose. When ink burns, it does not vanish, it only hides, much like our elusive culprit. As if by magic, faint lines began to emerge on the paper, slowly revealing a chilling message. Darnley is not, must not be trusted. Danger is near. Poirot leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the words, his voice dropping as he spoke aloud. Just as I suspected. Winslow knew he was trying to warn us, but someone silenced him before he could finish. A heavy silence fell over the room. Hastings felt his throat tighten. You mean, he began. But Poirot cut him off. Yes, he said, his gaze burning through Darnley. Felix Darnley is not who he claims to be. Hastings took a step back, his mind racing with the implications of Poirot's revelation. But if Winslow knew, why didn't he go to the authorities? Poirot placed the letter back on the desk with meticulous care. Because Hastings, when dealing with a man like Darnley, the police are not always trustworthy. After all, who was the first to arrive at the scene? Poirot's voice had shifted from calm to almost predatory. The room grew heavy with the weight of his words, and Hastings felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Darnley's facade was cracking, his shoulders taut with the effort to hold himself together. But Poirot wasn't finished yet. He stood, his eyes sharp as daggers. The final act of our play begins now, he declared. The tension in the grand hall thickened as the suspects, Elena Graves, the butler, the maids, all waited in anxious silence. In the center Darnley stood, his expression unreadable, as if daring Poirot to make his next move. Poirot stepped forward, his voice cool and measured. The moment of truth has arrived, he said. Darnley sneered, his lips curling into a mock smile. Truth, Poirot. And what grand theory have you cooked up now? Poirot smiled, but it was a smile that sent a chill through the room. Not a theory, Darnley. Certainty, he said, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous intensity. From the beginning, this case has been too convenient. A perfect suspect, clues arranged in a neat, tidy line. But murder, my friend, is rarely this simple. Unless, of course, the one investigating it is also the one controlling the entire game. Darnley's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but Poirot was already pressing on, his voice rising with undeniable confidence. You were the first on the scene, you steered the investigation, you planted evidence. But there was one thing you couldn't control, wasn't there? Hercule Poirot. Darnley's jaw clenched, and the room held its breath. Poirot pressed closer. Winslow was about to expose you, wasn't he? That's why he gathered those papers, why he reached out to me. But you couldn't allow that. You needed him silenced. You were the visitor that night, the one Winslow welcomed into his home. And it was you who pulled the trigger. The room went still. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper, but it was louder than thunder in the silence. You staged the scene. You burned the letter. You arrived not as the murderer, but as the investigator, controlling every single piece of the puzzle. Darnley's fists clenched at his sides, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. You have no proof, he spat. But Poirot was already smiling, a slow, knowing smile. Ah, but that's where you misunderstand, Inspector. I don't need proof. All I needed was for you to panic. And you've done that perfectly. Poirot's eyes locked onto Darnley's, his gaze like a vice. So now, dear Inspector, do you wish to confess, or shall I expose you for all to see? Darnley's breath hitched, his eyes flicking to the door, his mind racing. But Poirot simply smiled, the smile of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. You are trapped, mon ami, he said softly. And in that moment, Darnley knew there was no escape. The game was over. The air in the grand hall of Winslow Manor hung heavy with the scent of tension, the towering chandeliers casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist across the stone floor. The room was filled with an unease so thick it was almost tangible, as if every breath carried with it the weight of a secret just waiting to be exposed. At the center of it all stood Poirot, his posture unwavering, and his gaze sharp, taking in every flicker of discomfort among the gathered suspects. To his right, Hastings stood watchful, his expression unreadable, but his eyes ever alert, while across the room, Inspector Felix Darnley remained a silent enigma, his arms crossed tightly, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The others shifted restlessly, each of them a suspect, their faces ranging from pale apprehension to tightly controlled fear. Elena Graves, her defiance barely masking her vulnerability. The butler, his hands trembling ever so slightly. The maid, her gaze flickering nervously between the others. And the groundskeeper, his feet shifting in a restless rhythm. Poirot scanned them all with a cold, calculating eye, before his voice broke the stillness, smooth and deliberate, cutting through the silence like a blade. Mes amis, the moment of truth has arrived, he said softly, the words hanging in the air, each syllable punctuated with a palpable finality. The room seemed to inhale collectively, a murmur passing through the group as Poirot raised his hand, silencing them all. This case, from the very beginning, has been an enigma, too convenient, too perfect. A crime that practically solved itself, a suspect who fell into place too easily, and a detective who seemed almost too eager to play the part. But what if, mes amis? What if everything we thought we knew was a carefully orchestrated performance, a manipulation of the highest order? His voice dropped lower, the intensity in his gaze increasing as he turned toward Darnley. You were never meant to solve this case, Inspector, Poirot said, his tone now sharp with accusation. Because you, Felix Darnley, were the one who orchestrated it all from the very start. The words landed with a heavy thud, and for the first time the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Darnley's face remained inscrutable, but his eyes flickered, betraying just a hint of something, fear, anger, or perhaps something darker. Poirot stepped forward, his voice growing colder, more confident. You were the first on the scene. You steered the investigation. You planted evidence. And you manipulated every piece of this puzzle. And yet, Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. You made one critical mistake. You underestimated me. A chill ran through the room as Poirot turned to the others, his gaze never leaving Darnley. You thought you could control everything, but you couldn't control the truth. And now, the truth is unraveling before you. Poirot's eyes burned with intensity as he spoke, each word a dagger aimed directly at Darnley. You see, the man standing before you is not who he claims to be. Felix Darnley is an invention, a persona created from the shadows, a mask worn by a criminal who has hidden behind a badge for far too long. There is no record of Felix Darnley before 5 years ago, no history, no training, no assignments, nothing. A gasp rippled through the room as Hastings stepped forward, holding a stack of papers that seemed to weigh more heavily with every passing second. Through inquiries with Scotland Yard, Hastings began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. There is no trace of Felix Darnley before he appeared on the scene. He does not exist, not in the way he claims. Poirot's smile deepened, a predatory gleam in his eyes as he continued. You, Felix Darnley, are a fabrication, a master of deception, a man who constructed a new identity with the precision of a surgeon. And what better place for a man like you, someone skilled in the art of manipulation, than behind the very badge that is supposed to uphold justice? Darnley's smirk faltered for just a moment, but it was enough to send a ripple of satisfaction through Poirot. But it doesn't stop there, does it? Poirot's voice was low, almost a whisper. You didn't just fabricate an identity. You manipulated this case from the very beginning. You created the perfect crime, one that no one would suspect you of committing. And when it came time to play the part of the investigator, you slipped into that role seamlessly, guiding the investigation as though you were simply solving a puzzle. But the truth is, you were the one who made the puzzle in the first place. The room fell deathly silent. every eye now fixed on Darnley, who stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin, defiant line. Poirot's gaze never wavered. You shot Lord Winslow that night. You planted the evidence. You staged the scene. And when the time came, you arrived not as a detective, but as the orchestrator of it all. And now, with the truth laid bare, the game is over. The words hung in the air, an undeniable truth that seemed to reverberate through every corner of the room. The perfect crime, Poirot whispered. It was never perfect, not with me in the game. Darnley exhaled slowly, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. For a moment he seemed to consider making a break for the door, his gaze flickering to the exit. But Poirot was already 2 steps ahead. You are trapped, mon ami. The walls are closing in, and there is nowhere left to run. The tension in the room reached a boiling point as Poirot took one final step toward Darnley, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. So, Felix Darnley, he said, his tone laced with finality. Do you wish to confess, or shall I expose you for the fraud you are? Darnley's breath caught in his throat, his eyes narrowing, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might crumble under the weight of Poirot's gaze. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he allowed his lips to curl into a smile. The game was far from over. The atmosphere in the grand hall was suffocating, a thick silence hanging in the air as shadows stretched across the cold stone walls, their dark shapes elongating, like the secrets they concealed. At the heart of this tension stood Poirot, his gaze unwavering, a silent force of certainty amidst a sea of doubt. To his right was Hastings, his expression a careful blend of wariness and resolve, while Inspector Felix Darnley, ever the picture of composure, stood on the opposite side, his posture rigid, but his eyes flickering with something barely concealed, a threat, a lie, or perhaps the fear of being discovered. Surrounding them were the suspects, each one an enigma in their own right. Helena Graves, her pale skin a contrast to the storm of emotions swirling beneath her surface, defied the eyes upon her with an air of quiet defiance. The butler stood stiffly, his hands clasped before him, each finger an accusation in its own right. The housemaid, shifting uncomfortably between guilt and fear, cast furtive glances at the others, while the groundskeeper's foot shuffled nervously against the floor, as though trying to outrun his own thoughts. Poirot took in their every movement, the faintest flicker of suspicion in his gaze, before finally breaking the silence. We have arrived at the moment of truth. His voice was a soft murmur, but it reverberated through the room, carrying the weight of an inevitable revelation. A ripple of unease spread through the group. This case, from the very beginning, has been riddled with inconsistencies, too many convenient truths, a suspect too obvious, a detective too eager. His eyes swept briefly over Darnley, whose expression remained unfazed. What are you implying? Darnley's voice, smooth as silk, cut through the tension, but Poirot only smiled, a thin, knowing smile. Patience, mon ami. All will be revealed. His focus shifted to Helena Graves, a deliberate pause in his words. You were accused because your motives were clear. Your quarrel with Lord Winslow, the change in his will, but a crime is not merely about why, it is about who and how. Poirot's voice grew colder, sharper, as he turned towards Darnley. And the one who dictated the how is standing among us. A deathly hush fell over the room, all eyes now fixed on Darnley. The murderer, Poirot whispered, his words slicing through the tension like a blade, is not who he claims to be. The inspector's face tightened, his calm mask beginning to crack. Felix Darnley, Poirot said, his voice filled with finality. Or should I say, the man who calls himself Felix Darnley. Darnley's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. You are grasping at straws, Poirot. Poirot stepped forward, undeterred. Am I? He asked, his voice laced with an edge of certainty. He gestured to Hastings, who stepped forward with a stack of papers. Through careful inquiry, we discovered that no record exists of Felix Darnley before 5 years ago. No training, no assignments, no trace. A man who claims to be an inspector, yet is nowhere to be found until now. Poirot's voice dropped, his gaze locking onto Darley's. You, Darley, are not an inspector. You are a fraud. Gasps of shock rippled through the room. Poirot continued, his voice relentless. You created this identity, this persona, Felix Darley, brick by brick, woven seamlessly into the fabric of the law, unnoticed, unchallenged. Darley chuckled, though his smile was strained. If I were a fraud, surely someone would have noticed. Poirot's mustache twitched. And yet you have been careful, never drawing too much attention, never taking on a case too grand, always competent, but never extraordinary. You placed yourself in a position where no one would dare question you. Darley's smirk did not falter. And what would be my purpose? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Murder. A collective shudder ran through the room. Poirot's voice hardened. You manipulated this case from the very beginning. But now, mon ami, the game is up. The tension in the room was palpable, thick as smoke. Poirot took a deliberate step forward. Let me reconstruct the crime as it truly happened. He turned toward the others, his voice dropping lower, drawing them in. Lord Winslow had discovered something troubling. Fraud, theft, deception, and at the heart of it all was you, Darley. You were not merely an imposter, you were the criminal. Darley's face remained stiff, but Poirot could see the flicker of uncertainty. Winslow must have confronted you, perhaps even threatened to expose you, and when that happened, you knew you had no choice. You came to the manor that night, not as a detective, but as an executioner. Poirot's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. You killed him, you planted the evidence, and when the moment was right, you returned to the scene as the investigator, leading the charge to solve a crime you had orchestrated. The room fell into stunned silence. Poirot's gaze never left Darley's face, his words precise, deliberate. It was the perfect crime, you thought. Who would suspect the man leading the investigation? Darley's smirk faltered. Just for a moment. Poirot clasped his hands together, his eyes narrowing. But you made one fatal mistake. His voice, now thick with intensity, echoed across the hall. You underestimated me. Darley stood rigid, unwilling to show any sign of weakness, but his mind raced. Poirot's gaze turned cold, a steely resolve behind it. Allow me to introduce the final piece of the puzzle. With a flick of his wrist, Poirot gestured toward the table. A single revolver sat there, gleaming under the dim light, the identical twin to the one missing from the crime scene. Darley's eyes flickered. Poirot had found it. 2 guns, Poirot continued. One to kill, one to deceive. The first was planted at the crime scene, meant to make Miss Graves appear guilty. The second was hidden, held carefully in Darley's quarters, the real murder weapon. The room gasped. How did we find it? Poirot's gaze never wavered. In your own quarters, Inspector. The officer stepped forward, confirming the discovery. The gasps turned into murmurs of disbelief. You planted the first gun to frame Miss Graves. Poirot continued, his voice growing colder. But you kept the second, your true weapon, hidden until now. You thought you could escape. Darley's lips pressed together in a thin line. This is ridiculous, he spat. Poirot smiled faintly. But mistakes, mon ami, are inevitable. He turned toward the butler, who handed him a letter, old, faded, and singed at the edges. Poirot cleared his throat. Darnley is not who he claims to be, he read aloud. And this letter, it was his final plea. His last attempt to expose the truth before it was too late. Hastings leaned in. But the letter is incomplete. It ends abruptly. Poirot's voice grew grim. Indeed, he was interrupted. Interrupted before he could reveal all. Poirot turned to face Darley. And yet, even in death, Lord Winslow has exposed you. Darley shook his head slowly, dismissing the evidence. Circumstantial, he said coldly. A half-burned letter, and a gun. It proves nothing. Poirot sighed, almost pitying him. That's where you are wrong, my dear Darley. He paused, letting the weight of his next words hang in the air. I have one last surprise. Darley's smirk faltered ever so slightly. Poirot's hand gestured toward the door, and as if on cue it swung open. A woman entered, her face obscured by a veil. Darley's face drained of color. "No," he whispered. Poirot's voice was calm, almost taunting. "Oh yes, Miss Darley. You believed yourself thorough. You thought you covered every angle. But you overlooked one thing. The one person who saw you that night." The woman lifted her veil. It was one of the housemaids. Her hands trembled, and her voice quivered as she spoke. "I saw you. I heard raised voices in Lord Winslow's study. When I looked through the crack in the door, I saw you holding a gun. You killed him." A hushed gasp swept through the room. Poirot's gaze locked on Darley's. "And now, my dear Darley, your game is well and truly over." Darley's fists clenched. But before he could make a move, he lunged toward the door, desperate to flee. But Hastings stepped forward, only for Poirot to raise a hand. "No need, mon ami," he said. Darley reached the door, only to be met by the cold, unyielding presence of two constables blocking his escape. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You see, Darley, I anticipated a man like you would make one last desperate attempt to escape, and I was prepared." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Darley's labored breathing. The game was over. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. Darley's breath hitched, his chest rising and falling as his mind spiraled in 1,000 directions. His facade cracked for the briefest of moments before he steadied himself, allowing only the faintest trace of admiration to flicker in his eyes. Poirot watched him, the gleam in his eyes sharpening like a blade. "You've underestimated me, haven't you, Darley?" Poirot's voice was low, almost comforting in its calmness, yet every word laced with a dangerous edge. "This is far from over." Darley's lips curled into a smirk, one that spoke of an inner game, a deeper trick. "Oh, Poirot," he drawled, voice laced with amusement. "You may have won this little round, but I assure you, the game is far from over. It's never truly over, is it?" Poirot stood still, letting the silence creep between them, watching Darley's eyes flicker with a silent promise of retaliation. As Darley was led away, his every step echoed a challenge, and Poirot couldn't help but feel the heat of the impending storm. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud, sealing away the final act of this twisted dance. Hastings, standing beside Poirot, was the first to break the silence. "Do you think he meant it? That there's more to this?" His voice trembled slightly, but Poirot remained cool, his gaze fixed ahead. "Of course," Poirot murmured, his voice turning dark, almost prophetic. "The truth may have its own hand to play, but the game never ends. It just evolves." Hastings shivered, the words hanging in the air like a warning. Poirot remained silent for a moment, his mind replaying Darley's final words. "The game is never truly over." His fingers tightened subtly, as he took a slow, deliberate breath. "No, it isn't," he replied softly, almost to himself. His eyes narrowed as he looked towards the door, wondering what came next. The thrill of victory was momentarily tainted by a gnawing suspicion. There's always more. And as the door clicked shut, Poirot's instinct screamed at him that somewhere, another mystery was waiting to unravel, and he would be the one to solve it, no matter the cost.